Hi there, and thanks for being here. I'm your instructor, Scott Duffy. I am so excited that you've signed up for this course, and I hope that you're excited to learn about developing for Microsoft Azure. In this section, I've already said what you need to get started with this course, and so hopefully you've got your Azure account already, you've downloaded and installed Visual Studio, and you've bookmarked the Azure Samples GitHub repository, okay? If you haven't done that, stop here and go do that. You're going to learn and remember more by attempting to do things yourself after watching the videos in this course. From time to time in this course, I'm going to pop back in and ask you to try something on your own as an assignment. So when you see these videos that are marked as activities, then be prepared to go into the Azure portal or into Visual Studio or into PowerShell and try it yourself. Don't be afraid of that. If you succeeded, it proves you've learned the topic, but if you fail at first and it takes you some time to figure it out, you've learned how to overcome those common mistakes. In this course, there's also going to be little quizzes that are meant to check your understanding of what was just taught in the preceding section. This is simply meant to improve your ability to remember what you've learned by forcing you to recall it. They're not supposed to be simulations of the real exam. If you find that you're not passing the little quizzes, feel free to go back and rewatch the lectures associated with those questions. Another tip is to take notes. A lot of students find taking notes is very helpful. Feel free to speed up the videos if I talk too slow. Sometimes I talk too slow, that's fine. You can also turn on closed captions if it will help you to follow along. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the appropriate section of the course. If you feel like you can help others with their questions, go ahead and answer some of their questions as well. If you're asked to leave a review while watching this course, I would be so grateful for your feedback and comments that will help this course get found by future students. I do read every review, and I'm grateful for that. Thanks for watching, and let's get into the first core concept of Microsoft Azure. Now, one of the things that you can do within cloud computing platforms like Azure is to create what are called virtual machines. Now, if you're not familiar with what a virtual machine is, it's basically a machine that you can control. It's called infrastructure as a service. You can use either SSH or RDP. Those are remote protocols in order to control machines remotely to get into those machines and basically install software. And it's going to look and act very much like you had a computer running within your local environment. This is an example of a virtual machine. Very soon we're going to talk about how to create one. I'll get into the creation steps, but this is just the overview of what a virtual machine is. So I've just created this virtual machine. It's a Windows virtual machine running on a very small, very tiny type of virtual machine instance with one virtual CPU and only 2 gigabytes of memory, sort of an underpowered server, but it's good for demonstrations. And I just fired this up. Now, I used Windows Remote Desktop Protocol to remote into this. You see here that I have a public IP address that I can control this machine with, and I opened up the port for RDP, which is 3389. So I've actually intentionally opened up this port so that from my home computer, I can connect to this virtual machine. So I'm going to put this to full size, and we can see here that this virtual machine looks and acts very much like it's just any other computer. This is a brand new, fresh install of Windows Server 2016. Okay, so now as I booted up this machine, the first thing it's asking me is, what do I want this machine to be? So this machine, it really has very little installed on it. You can see there's only a couple of things here under the Programs menu. If I wanted this machine to be a web server, I very easily can go through the wizard just like you would for running this machine on your local, and I can choose a web server role for this machine, and it's basically going to install all of the stuff that's required to make this virtual machine a web server. Now, I am going to have to open up the ports for port 80 or for port 443 in order to access this virtual machine from outside. So there is going to be a network problem because these machines have to be sort of closed off by default. But you see, it's very easily and very similar. If you have any experience working with servers in a development environment or within your local environment, the experience of installing a web server is very much similar to the way that you would do it within the cloud. Okay. Now, this machine is going to basically, it's going to run as long as it's running, right? So I'm going to minimize this. I am being charged, this machine is a standard B1MS virtual machine. Now we can see from the Azure's pricing calculator that a B1MS virtual machine with 1 CPU and 2 gigabytes of RAM, it runs about 3 cents per hour. And if you do this pay-as-you-go, which is basically paying by the second, it's going to run about $21 a month for a full month of this virtual machine. So it's very inexpensive. Now there are other ways of pricing this if you're willing to commit to a full year and you're going to pay whether or not you use it. That price drops down to $14 a month. And if you commit to 3 years, same deal, whether you use it or not, it's $10 a month. And if you bring your own license, so let's say you don't pay Microsoft for the Windows license at the Azure level, but you have a corporate license that you can use, then you can pay as low as $7.50 a month roughly for a 3-year reserved with hybrid license. So the pricing can get very cheap. But even if you're just paying as you go, $20 a month for a virtual machine, billed by the second. So if you only need this virtual machine for 10 minutes, then really you're only going to pay a fraction of a penny in order for that level of virtual machine usage, okay? Now, keep in mind that a lot of other things are charged separately. So if you need extra hard disk space, let's say you need two 32 gig hard drives, it's $1.50 a month for a 32 gig hard drive. And so having 2 of them ends up an additional $3 on your cost. And if you're going to have a lot of storage transactions, so all of the egress from Azure to the outside world, you're paying 4/100ths of a cent for those, and you could end up paying more in storage transaction costs than for the actual VM at that low level. Okay, so VMs can be very cheap, and then they can also be very expensive. If you look at some of the high compute optimized instances, so let's go down to the E64 down here, $7.50 per hour. So even some of the most powerful computers with 64 CPUs and 400 gigabytes of RAM, it's running about $7.50 for an hour. So if you only need that for a day, that can be very affordable depending on your project. So virtual machines are computers that are very similar to the computers that are running in your local environment that you can remote into, that you can install any software that you like, and that makes you fully responsible for everything that is installed on there in terms of security and other updates. But it's basically infrastructure, computing power that you can rent by the second. And that's what a virtual machine is. So in this section, we're going to be talking about virtual machines. So I stopped this virtual machine so that I can stop the charges. Virtual machines are charged by the minute, and if your virtual machine is not running, then that means you're not going to get charged for the compute element of that. Now, you are still charged for storage. So if I did have any external disks or a temporary disk relating to this, that I'm going to still be charged for that, but it's a relatively small charge compared to the per second charge or the per hour charge for running a virtual machine. So let's go to the dashboard. First off, my dashboard is going to look different than yours. I've customized this a little bit. The colors are different. I've got some tiles on here that you might not have. I'm not going to get into customizing your dashboard right now, but just keep in mind that you can create multiple different dashboards, and it's going to basically be different for you and for me and for everyone else. You can change the colors, you can change how these tiles look, etc. Now on the left is your Azure portal menu. It goes from everything from create a resource. You've got both a home screen and a dashboard. A home screen is relatively new. It actually just contains some shortcuts to virtual machines and some other hot points within Azure. Dashboard, like I said, is the customizable element. All services is going to be a big thing. You're going to want to go in there lots of times looking for things that you know you have running, but you don't necessarily want to dig into all resources and stuff like that. The rest of this is customizable. You'll see it says favorites. And so I can put here whatever I want, the most common resources that I go to within my Azure account. For now, we're going to go into the create a resource. Now, using this double arrow, I can minimize that to free up some space. We want to create a compute resource. Now, under this menu, we get several featured compute resources, including Windows, Red Hat, Ubuntu, and some other types of virtual machines that even have other additional software installed on top of it. I'm going to choose the Windows Server to start. Okay, we'll talk about Linux because that's an important part of this exam as well. Now there's this wizard. It is a 6-tab wizard that takes you through creating of a virtual machine. The first decision you have to make is your subscription. I only have one subscription, and maybe you only have one subscription. Mine is the pay-as-you-go plan, which means I get charged for all the resources I create. You might have the free account. We talked about creating an Azure account. So you might say free plan here. Or you might have an enterprise account where your company is paying for it, and there might be an enterprise account here. Or you might even have an MSDN subscription, and you get certain credits based on your MSDN. And so depending on your license, you're going to have a different thing here. All resources, all computing resources have to live inside a resource group. A resource group is like a folder structure that you can organize all the resources in your account. When you're getting into Microsoft Azure and you're starting to create resources, even in a production setting, you're going to quickly have hundreds of running resources, including the resource groups themselves, virtual networks, and IP addresses. Everything that you do within Azure pretty much creates you a resource, not just the computes. And so you're going to want to organize that into like a folder structure. So this resource group is very much like subfolders on your computer. I tend to create a new resource group every time I have a project that I'm starting up. I want to organize all the resources into the same group. This makes it very easy to view them. It's also very easy to see the charges that are all related to each other because resource groups, you can break the cost structure down to that level. The security becomes easier because you can break security settings down to the resource group level. And it's easy to delete them and clean them up. So once we're done with this example, I can go through, delete this resource group, and it will delete all the resources that were created. So you give your resource group a name. There's this Create New button. You click it, you give it a name. I'm going to put this into my existing resource group called AZ-203 New VM. Now the virtual machine itself needs a name. Okay, so we're creating a VM, and this name needs to be unique for the resource group. Now I already have a virtual machine called this. We just looked at it. So it says the virtual machine name must be unique to the current resource group. So I'm going to actually say the number 2. So this virtual machine is unique within this resource group. The region. Now there are something like 50 plus regions of the world that you can deploy your VMs into. Everything from Australia, South America, Canada, the US has many regions. Europe is rapidly expanding, and Asia as well. There's China. What you might say, well, I don't see 50 regions in this list. Well, that's because a lot of those regions are restricted. So for instance, China would not be in here because you need to have a separate agreement with another company besides Microsoft that's based out of China to run your virtual machine inside of China. The government resources are not going to be in here. So government regions, Department of Defense regions, those are also off limits. So Microsoft is creating regions specifically for government organizations. If you're not part of that, then you're not going to see it. So let's choose Central US. It's a good enough place to create your resources. The only thing this really impacts is that not every region has every instance type. So let's say there's a brand new announced instance that has 128 CPUs and 1,024 terabytes of memory and all this great stuff. it might only be released in 2 or 3 regions the first time that it comes out. It takes a while for all features to get deployed to all regions. So the region does impact your choice of virtual machines. Now we haven't talked about availability yet, but basically you can set up your servers to be highly available, and that would be within this. I'm going to skip this for now, but we'll come back to it. Choosing what image to choose. So we're creating a virtual machine. We have, like we said earlier, Windows and Linux options. Okay, you cannot create a virtual machine that does not have any operating system. That is not possible. It has to be, there's currently 9 items on this list. It has to be one of these 9 items to start within this interface. When you're using PowerShell and CLI, you've got other options, and then you can also have custom images where you create your perfect image with all your tools installed, create that as an image, and then you would use a PowerShell script to deploy that. But we're just talking about the portal at this second. So we got Windows Server 2008, 2012, and 2016 as options, and Windows 10. I'm going to choose Windows Server 2016 because I don't have a reason to choose them other. Now you can see that there's Browse All. So this list is the quick pick list, and we can actually get to see other images from the Browse All. Now, basically the first really major decision you have to make is the virtual machine size. Now by default, it's always recommending this DS1 to me. Now in the last video we were looking at the B1MS, which was around $16 a month for a virtual machine. This DS1 is more expensive. So I'm going to say change size, and we can see the one that they're recommending is $119 a month Canadian. And like I said, the B1MS, this is 28 Canadian, it's quoting me here. So we can go through based on our needs and choose from dozens and dozens of virtual machine types. So let's say you want to see a virtual machine that either is medium, let's make it the large type, okay? So now we can see there's only 2 of them that are being offered to me. Now, I have a restriction on my account, and most people would have a restriction the first time you created an account, in that you have a limit, I believe, of 10 CPUs unless you ask Microsoft to extend that. So this is for your own protection. I don't want to accidentally create a $6,000 a month virtual machine. So before you ask Microsoft to upgrade your number of CPUs, you may want to realize the consequences of this action, okay? So this particular one, I don't have the limit on my account that would support that. So I'm going to remove that, and we're going to create the B1MS for testing purposes. Again, it's 1 CPU, 2 gigabytes of RAM. It supports a maximum of 2 data disks. It comes with 0 by default, and you would have to add 1 or 2 for additional charge if you want. Those data disks are basically 800 operations per second. So it's because it's the B1MS type of account, that gives you a little bit faster I/O operations and more per second. If you go to the cheaper B1S option, you only get 400 operations per second. The disk is a bit slower. Okay, so we're going to choose B1MS. Now, you do need to give it a user ID and password. Now, because this is a Windows server, this user ID and password is what you're going to use to log into RDP, and is what you're going to use to log into Windows. So this is basically an admin account on this computer that you can log in remotely. So I filled out a user ID and a password. We're going to pause this and come back in the next video and continue on with creating a virtual machine. Now the last 2 questions on the first page of this wizard talk about allowing inbound traffic. By default, all inbound internet traffic is blocked. So there will be no open ports between the internet and this machine by default. Let's say I know that I want to connect to this machine using RDP. So I can allow RDP connections into this box. Now I also might know I want to turn this into a web server, and so I can open up the HTTP and HTTPS ports in anticipation of turning it into a web server. If this was a Linux machine, you would want to open up the SSH port because you would use an SSH tool to connect to a Linux machine. So I am going to open up 3 ports. Now, of course, this is a security concern. You do not want RDP to be open to the internet forever. You'll want to open it up until you need to use it, log into it, etc. And then you want to either shut it down, close the port, or restrict it to only your computer and only your corporate network. So putting on some intelligent blocks on RDP access makes great sense. We already talked about saving money with a Windows license that already exists. We don't have one, so we're going to skip that. Now remember, this virtual machine comes with up to 2 temporary disk storage, essentially, 2 data disks. And so this is where you would create a data disk if you wanted it. Okay, so up to 2. There is a temporary storage that already comes with it, and you're going to get it as a flash SSD drive. And that's what you're going to get for the temporary disk. Now, we are not going to talk about virtual networks in this lesson. It's not a focus of the test, to be honest, either. So this is going to create a brand new virtual network, put it onto the default subnet. It's going to create a brand new public IP address. I'm going to open up those ports I already selected. The security group settings are going to be basic. We're not going to get any advanced security settings on this. If you needed your computers to speak with each other at an accelerated rate, then you would have accelerated networking on, although I'm choosing B1MS and it doesn't support accelerated networking. We can put this into a load balancer right now. We don't have a load balancer to put that into. I'm going to turn off diagnostics. This is where you get logging from your machine. But I do want to turn on auto shutdown. I'm notorious for creating virtual machines for testing purposes and then not coming back to that for a couple of days, and then finding that I've incurred $10 or $20 in charge. So whenever I create a virtual machine, I always try to have this as an auto shutdown. So at 7 p.m. every day, this machine will shut down, and I put this in Eastern time zone. Now, do I need the machine to have a notification pop up to say that it's going to be shut down? In this case, no. But to me, this is charges that you don't need to incur. This is one way to protect against that. We won't turn on any backups or anything like that at this point. Now, the last page of this wizard is the review screen. This is where we can see we're agreeing to a 3.85 cents per hour charge. This is the review of all of the settings. We can certainly go through here. Now I could just go click create, and in about 10 minutes I'll have a virtual machine running. Another option is to download this settings as a template for automation. So Microsoft has things called ARM templates that are JSON files that I could either store within Azure. There's a template manager, or I can download to my machine. And so all of the choices that I've made will be retained, and then I can create virtual machines again and again and again from this template instead of having to remember all these settings and go through that laborious work. So if I did want to start up the process of automation, this is where I go for that. But I'm just going to click create. Let this deploy. It takes a couple minutes, and we'll come back and we'll see our virtual machine running. Now, one thing I really like is this deployment overview. When you do create a resource, it basically shows you all of the items that are being created, and you can just sort of watch it. This deployment took 4 minutes and 41 seconds, so under 5 minutes to get a virtual machine created, including a network interface card and a public IP address and a network security group. So there's a number of resources that are being created. I'm going to click the Go to Resource button. Now, before we review the actual resource itself, let's look at the resource group. Now I do have two virtual machines in this resource group. Remember I said that a resource group is a folder that contains resources. It's an organizational structure that basically allows your Azure portal and Microsoft Azure itself not to get too crazy with the hundreds of resources. I have two virtual machines in here. That means two data disks, two network interface cards, two network security groups, two IP addresses, two virtual machines, and one virtual network. Okay, so that's two VMs and a virtual network within the same resource group. Now, let's go down here. We can see the virtual machine type AZ-203 new VM2. So that's the VM that we created. It's running a Windows operating system, the B1MS size that we expected. Like I said, it has a public IP address, so we can access this by IP address. Now, if the IP address is awkward for you, you can always give a fully qualified domain name. So I go into the IP address, you'll see that there's a domain that's .centralus.cloudapp.azure.com. So I can always say AZ new VM2 and basically save this, and this IP address will then have this fully qualified name if that's what we want. Okay, let's go back to the virtual machine. So now there's nothing running on this machine. It's a brand new install, and so if you visited this IP address using your browser, well, we did open up port 80, so it would attempt to connect to that machine, but there's nothing listening on the other end. We don't have this machine configured as a web server. To do that, we go to this connect button here at the top, and depending on whether it's a Windows or a Linux virtual machine, we're going to get instructions for connecting to it using either RDP or SSH. With RDP, you will connect to it using its public IP address over port 3389. Remember that we opened port 3389 in order for our public internet, which is what we're on, in order to connect to this VM. We can go right to the RDP file, which is a file that you can download and you can actually use to connect to this virtual machine. Now, I'm not going to be able to log into this machine as myself. I have to say more choices and use a different account. Remember when we created this virtual machine, we gave it a user ID and password. I'm not going to give you mine, but you hopefully remember that you created a user ID and password for admin credentials when you created this virtual machine. So you enter your admin credentials and say OK. Now this is the first time we're connecting to this virtual machine, and there's no way to verify this identity. We don't recognize it. Okay, the certificate says the certificate is not trusted by certifying authority. So we do have to accept this certificate despite the errors. Now we can see that RDP is connecting. This just like you would have a server on your own network that you're connecting to RDP. The first time you'll log into it, it has to set up your user profile, so there's a lot of desktop related things going on. Okay, I'm going to pause the video while this is going on, and then we can come back and we'll set this up as a web server just for fun. Now occasionally you're going to have a machine that isn't operating the way that you expect. So for instance, this virtual machine that we just created, I'm trying to connect into it using remote desktop, and I get only so far, and my machine is basically just blackness here. Now I have closed this and tried to connect again, and the same result. So what you can do for a machine that's misbehaving is you can actually use the Azure portal to restart the machine. So that is going to be one solution for RDP not being able to connect. So being able to click this restart button, and then we'll see this machine cycle right within the Azure portal. So if you're having trouble connecting with RDP, one option is to do the restart. Another possible issue you might be having is connecting to the machine at all. Let's say RDP isn't working. You're trying to connect and there's just no traffic being allowed through. That could be a firewall issue. Now within Microsoft Azure, there are firewalls on three particular places. One could be the virtual network. Now we just created this virtual network and I know that there are no firewalls set up. Let's go into it to show that. So if I go down to the subnet and I see that we have the default subnet, there is no security group. That means there's no firewall filters that are blocking traffic at the subnet level. If we go back to the virtual machine and go into the networking tab, the other aspect of the security is on the virtual machine network interface card. And so we can see that there are, in fact, network security rules, and we can see there's a network security group that has certain rules. I can see that the RDP setting is enabled, port 3389, allowing inbound traffic from any source to any destination. So in this case, I know that port 3389 is getting through. But if you're having difficulty even connecting, you might want to go to the VM under networking and you'll see if the port 3389 appears as an inbound port rule. And if it doesn't, then you'll have to add it. Finally, within the machine itself, there's a Windows firewall that runs on the machine, and so hopefully RDP is enabled from there. If not, we've got bigger problems and we may have to recreate this virtual machine if RDP has been removed as a firewall setting on Windows. But that's unlikely. It's either going to be a network security group rule or you're going to have a virtual machine that is frozen or hung for some reason. So I've successfully done the restart. We can see the CPU spikes around the original creation and now with the restart. And so I should be able to connect to this machine using RDP. So now that we've fixed that issue, we can log into the server, and like we said, we saw that this machine is just like it's a freshly installed Windows. If we look at the Windows menu, there's really very little installed. We can go through this server manager and basically turn this machine into whatever we want it to be. We can install any software that we wish. This could be a developer's workstation. This could be a server. We can basically just go through the setup and create this to be whatever we like. So in this section, we've created a virtual machine and we've tested that it's working. Now it is a bit underpowered. We're going to get errors relating to the amount of memory that this machine doesn't have. And so keep that in mind, but we do have a working virtual machine. It wasn't that hard to create. So our resource group is starting to get a number of resources in it. And let's start to remove some of them. I'll show you how to delete resources. Now within a virtual machine, there is a delete button. But deleting your virtual machine really only deletes the virtual machine element and not the IP address, not the network security group and other aspects that were created. So there is a delete button within the virtual machine. The reason we created this in its own resource group is because you can then delete the entire resource group, and deleting the resource group will delete all of the resources inside of it. Now in this instance, with two virtual machines in this resource group, I'm going to leave the resource group alone, but I'm only going to delete the virtual machines and stuff that is inside of it. So I've selected all of the items. Now I think I will keep the virtual network. There's no reason to delete it. It doesn't cost me anything to have one. And the next time I create a virtual machine, I can just install it there. So I've selected 10 out of the 11 items, and I can go up here to the delete button, and I just have to type YES, and it will permanently delete all of these resources. They are non-recoverable, including disks and network interface cards. Now, the reason I'm deleting this is because we're going to talk about automation, and particularly ARM templates in this video. So let's go through the process of creating another virtual machine. I'm going to go over here, Windows Server 2016. We're going to put that into our existing resource group, and we have to give it a name. So AZ SJD new VM3, and I'm going to choose the smaller B1MS as my favorite. Okay, I'm not going to do anything about availability just yet. Have to give it the user ID and password. And we're just going to accept all the default settings, and we're going to go right to the review screen. Okay, so we didn't have to go through all of those things. Now, we mentioned before that the template is available for download. Let's take a look at what that means. So, clicking on Download Template, it takes me to this template screen. Now, I haven't created the virtual machine yet, but I can see what Microsoft Azure is going to do in order to create it. Okay. Now, there are three components to this template. There's the template itself, which is this JSON file. Now, if we were to go through, in this video and the next video, we'll talk about the different components of this template. But we can see that there are a number of resources that are covered in here. I'm going to minimize this. We've got a network interface card, network security group, public IP address, a virtual machine, and a storage account for diagnostics, because I didn't turn off diagnostics. Okay, so there are 5 resources being created by this template, and so we should be able to look at the JSON file under the resources section, and we will see all of the different resources. So that's in one of the network interface cards. We scroll a little bit, network security group. Scroll a little bit more. There's a virtual machine settings. Now, when we look at the details of what's being configured here in terms of creating this template, you'll see that it actually refers to parameters. So it's not actually hard-coded what the settings are. Okay, even though these are the 5 resources, the settings are going to come in from external sides. Okay, even the OS disk is a parameter, for instance. Okay, although the type of operating system is not. Scrolling down some more, we've got our storage account. Okay, those are the 5 resources. So that's just one of the 3 components here, is the template. Now the parameters. The parameters is also a JSON file. And this is basically what I've entered into the portal. I chose the central US location. A network interface card was automatically assigned for me. Scrolling down a little bit, the virtual machine name I entered, etc. Okay, so the parameters and the template are kept separate. Now, in order to deploy this, I would use a script such as this PowerShell script. You'll see that it takes in 2 files, a template JSON and parameters JSON. And if we scroll down, we're going to see that it basically creates a new resource group, and then it's going to do a deployment. So a new Azure RM resource group deployment based on the template and based on the parameters. That's basically what it's doing. So it's got the template file, the parameters file, and then a script in order to take those files and execute them. So we can basically download this. There's a download button, and we can basically, for the template parameters and the scripts, download them, and then we can modify them. So on our local machine, we can go through and say, you know what, I want to deploy this into Eastern US. I want to deploy this into Western Europe. I want to deploy this into Canada. Just change the location, and it will. We can redeploy it. Now we will have to not only change the location, but the name of the network interface card. We'll have to change the public IP address name, because obviously that's going to need to be unique depending on where we deploy this. But if we wanted to deploy this in multiple places with changing of 3 or 4 variables, we should be able to do that. The other thing we can do is we can add this to the template library. So we can give this a name, and we can say that this is our preferred developer desktop, for instance, and save that as a template to the library. So we can see that Azure templates are basically a flexible way of doing automation. You can check this code into your source control, into GitHub or into whatever you use for your source control repository, and you will have a snapshot of your environment that's reproducible. So all of these things that you're doing within the portal can get described as JSON templates. And so one of the advantages is this becomes things that can be reproduced. There's also a thing called dynamic state configuration, DSC. It's more of an operations task, but keeping your production environment in a constant known state and avoiding what's called drift, right? Configuration drift, where somebody goes in, changes a setting, doesn't tell anyone, doesn't document it. That kind of stuff happens in production networks. And so using dynamic state configuration, which is done using ARM templates, is another way of protecting your production environment. So this is how you would get the template for an ARM template that you've, a virtual machine that you've created using the portal. We're going to download this and we're going to use this as a way to do some modifications to this. So we're not actually going to even deploy what we've done. We're just going to download it, and then we're going to go into this template and edit it. So in this video, we're going to go over how to encrypt the operating system and the data disks within a virtual machine. Now, the files in an Azure storage account are by default encrypted using what's called secure storage encryption. But once you've basically able to see the VHD within a storage account, the VHD itself is not encrypted. So you can use what's called BitLocker in order to encrypt the virtual disk within Azure. Now, the cryptographic keys for this are going to be stored in an Azure Key Vault. So the first thing you're going to need is what's called a Key Vault. If you go into the marketplace and you look up Key Vault, then you're going to see that Key Vault's a Microsoft product, and you're going to, if you don't have one, you're going to need to create one. Now, I happen to have a Key Vault, and so I'm going to use the one that I already have, but creating one should be pretty straightforward. Now, with a Key Vault, Key Vaults allow you to store secrets, and these secrets can be either keys, cryptographic keys in this case, secrets that are application secrets, or security certificates. In order to encrypt a virtual disk, we need to use keys. So I'm going to go into the keys section of my Key Vault. Keep in mind that in order to encrypt the Key Vault for a virtual machine, it has to exist in the same region as the virtual machine itself. So if you have a virtual machine in the West US region, then your Key Vault will also have to be in the West US region. So in this type of situation, the region is very important. Now I'm going to click the Generate Import for a key. Now I have to give this key a name. Now you can name it anything you want. I'm going to call it AZ-SJD Disk Encryption. Just to give myself a little clue as to say this key is going to be used for disk encryption. Now I'm going to keep the defaults here, so I'm going to use RSA encryption algorithm and 2048 key bit size. I'm not going to set activation or expiration on that, and I'm going to create it in an enabled state. So let's just create the key first. Now once that's been done, in order to encrypt a virtual machine, well, of course you're going to need a virtual machine. Now I don't have one currently running, but let's create a virtual machine, and I'm not going to go through that again because we just created videos around creating a virtual machine, but I'm going to go through this process of creating a virtual machine. Make sure that the machine is in the same region as your Key Vault, as an example. I'll go through this process, and at the end of this I'm going to come back to the video, so let's come back to that. So I just went through the setup process for creating a virtual machine. You can see here that I've chosen the standard DS1 virtual machine. You can only do encryption on standard or above virtual machines. And I've got all my usual information. So I'm going to click Create, and by default I'm going to create a virtual machine that, even though the storage account uses secure storage encryption, the virtual machine itself is not encrypted other than that. So this is an unencrypted virtual machine by default. So creating this virtual machine very fast now. It's less than 4 minutes to create a brand new virtual machine. Now, I'm not going to do anything with this virtual machine. We're just creating it, and we just want to encrypt the operating system disk. I can obviously go to it and see that it's running as a standard VM. Actually, if we go into the disk section of the virtual machine, we can see that we have an operating system disk, and it is not enabled. So the encryption of this disk is not yet enabled. Okay? So what we want to do is we want to enable disk encryption on this. Now, to do this, I'm going to use PowerShell. Some of you may know about the Azure Cloud Shell with this greater than sign and the underscore up here on the top. The Azure Cloud Shell allows you to run both command lines in Bash or PowerShell scripts in the PowerShell emulator. And this is all within the browser. So I'm going to pull this up a little bit, and it's starting up a brand new PowerShell session for me in my browser. Now, if this is your first time running Cloud Shell, you're going to have to go through a little setup process. Cloud Shell needs a storage account in which it stores its files. Like I can do an ls here, and I can see that I have a bunch of files in PowerShell here. And so there's a storage account associated with this, and if I was to delete it, I would have to recreate it. So I've already created a Cloud Shell account, so don't need to do that. Now, what we want to do is we want to run some PowerShell scripts to encrypt this disk. Now, I went to the Microsoft Docs website. docs.microsoft.com has a lot of great information. And one of the things it has is there's a script, go down here, for encrypting the virtual machine. So we've already gotten past the step of creating the key vault and creating the virtual machine itself using the portal. But I'm going to use a PowerShell to create the virtual machine, and we can see there's a sort of a standard script here. Now I'm going to minimize that. Now I've copied the script out to a text editor, and I modified it for my own values. So we're going to run through this script one line at a time here, and we're going to get this brand new virtual machine running with a BitLocker encrypted disk. Now, the first line of the script is to get the key vault. Remember, we have created, or we have a key vault running within a region, and so we're just going to grab that and put that into a variable with the get Azure RM key vault. Next up, we need the URI for that. Now, every key vault has a universal resource identifier, and so this URI, like I can say, disk, wonder if I can tab, yes I can. I can basically call this as my key vault URL, right? So it's AZ-203 key vault.vault.azure.net. Now I also need the resource D. So Microsoft refers to resources using an ID system. And if we were to look at the resource ID, we can see that there's /subscriptions. This is my subscription ID, /resource groups. This is the resource group name, and this is the resource type, and that's the name of the key vault. And so lots of information embedded in this resource ID. Okay, we have that in a variable. Now we need the encryption key. So remember, we created an encryption key within our key vault. So we need to get key vault key, pass it our key vault information, and it'll return the key and the actual encryption key URL. So that's all the preamble stuff. Now we need to basically run the set, I'm going to paste this in here, set Azure RM VM disk encryption extension. We pass it the name of our virtual machine and the resource group. We pass it all the variables we've collected in terms of the key vault URL and then the key itself. Okay, the URL and ID for both. And if we run this, it's going to take, I'm going to hit enter, it's going to tell me this commandlet prepares the virtual machine, enables encryption, which may reboot the machine. So this is obviously needs to take the machine down in order to enable encryption on the disk, and takes 10 to 15 minutes to finish. So if you are using a production virtual machine, or this is an actively virtual machine being actively used, then you might want to stop that, pause that, etc. But in this case, the virtual machine just is sitting there. So when I click yes, that's going to go off and start to encrypt the operating system disk of the virtual machine. Again, that takes 10 to 15 minutes to run. So I'm going to let that run, and when we come back, fingers crossed, hopefully, our virtual machine is going to have encrypted operating system disks. Hi there! We're coming to the end of Objective 1.1. I hope you're enjoying the course so far. If you are, be sure and go and leave a review for me in the Udemy platform. I would really appreciate that. If you've already left a review, you can certainly update that review if you've got more to say, new information, etc. In this video, we're going to talk about practice. It's time for you to pause this video at the end of the video, go into the Azure portal, and create yourself your own virtual machine, the A0, smallest size of either Windows or Linux virtual machine. What the purpose of this is, I want you to actually go through the process yourself instead of just watching me do it. Fill out the fields, see what the error messages are, see, the kinds of screens that you're going to have to go through, create it, see how long it takes, remote into it or SSH into it, and you have control of this machine. Now you can certainly stop it at the end of that, get that set up, and then once you've tested that it's working, stop it. But I definitely want you to, or encourage you to try it for yourself, because that's how you're really going to learn and absorb, and this is going to come into you. And we get into the next section on configuration, and we get into talking about availability sets and load balancing, other things in the future. Then all of this stuff, you'll have already gone through it and internalized it. So I encourage you, don't have to, but I encourage you to stop the course, pause the course, go play around with Azure, create a virtual machine, and then once you've done that, come back and pick it up. Thanks.